Welcome, everyone, to the Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Scott Wiener. Have the honor of representing San Francisco and northern San Mateo County in the California State Senate. And I am here tonight in conversation with Chris Hughes, who his new book, Market Crafters, The 100-Year Struggle to Shape the American Economy. I assume everyone read it, beginning to end. So let me tell you a little bit about Chris, who has a long and pretty amazing history. He's an economist and writer. He serves as chair of the Economic Security Project, which is a leading nonprofit advocating to empower all Americans economically. He co-founded Facebook. He was one of the OGs, and he later directed then Senator Barack Obama's digital organizing efforts in his 2008 campaign. Chris, welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Great to have you. And let me just ask you, just to start off, especially for those who may not have read the book or maybe read it a month ago and don't remember.
It only came out a month ago. So.
Yeah, exactly. What is market crafting and what isn't it? Because I know in the book, you definitely are very precise about what counts and what doesn't count.
Absolutely. So before I go into Market Craft, I just want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to be here. It's a pleasure to be back in San Francisco and to see some familiar faces and new ones. And it's an honor to share the stage with you, Senator Wiener. I'm a big fan of your work, even though I live in New York on the other coast. I follow all of the work that you're doing on so many critical issues, from housing to artificial intelligence and many more. So I feel a little awkward, to be honest, because I want to know more about what you're thinking about all these things, but hopefully we can make it as interactive as possible. So market craft. The market craft is when policymakers and government guide and harness markets towards public ends, like making Americans richer, making us safer, making our financial lives more stable. And in the book, I tell the stories of a dozen people who've done this, charting a lot of their successes, because there are many, and some of their failures, and tease out the lessons for economic policy and broader public policy, to be honest, today, particularly in this moment of chaos that we're living through. I think we need these kind of hopeful stories to know how to rebuild on the other side.
Great. And what are some things that people might think of as market craft that aren't?
That are not?
Yes, and I know you talk about that a little bit in the book, because sometimes people can have an overbroad view of what it is.
So when I started writing this book, I thought I was actually writing a history of the Fed, of the Federal Reserve. And then there was this explosion of interest in industrial policy in the Biden years, particularly around climate, semiconductors, competition policy, and a few other topics. And what I was searching for myself was some kind of vocabulary where anytime somebody in government was saying, hey, we like the private sector, we want the energy of the private sector, but we don't want to sit on our laurels and just wait for it to do its thing. We want to harness that and say, we're going to put public dollars in clean energy as a way to attract many more private dollars towards the climate crisis. So the institutions of market craft that I talk a lot about in the book are the Fed, which has a mission for financial and price stability. Things like the CHIPS and Science Act, which I think was a clear attempt to organize and support semiconductor markets. Energy resiliency, like with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the National Investment Bank, which was called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. I go through all of these institutions which are responsible for crafting and managing markets towards a goal. And then there's all kinds of stuff that's economic policy that isn't really about crafting markets. So we can lots of things affect economies. Roads affect economies, schools affect economies, relative tax rates affect economies. These are all real policies, obviously. but if they're not deployed in a way to support a particular market or to craft it or shape it, to change it from the way it's been to the way it should be, then they don't really qualify, at least in my vernacular, as market craft. So the whole point of what I'm trying to do here is take this moment when everybody wants to talk about industrial policy and say, wait a second, we're actually crafting all kinds of markets: healthcare, pharmaceuticals, airlines. None of these is a free market regulated only by supply and demand. The state is structuring them and deciding at the least how the boundaries of how they function, and in some cases, even more precisely designing them.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I found, that there are many things I found interesting about the book, but one of them is that we tend to have, when we have public policy debates, it's like the debate about, are you for free market and just letting private enterprise do its thing, or are you more like a socialist and want the government to control everything? And what you're asserting in this book, which I think is true, is it's never been one or the other. That you have the government, what government does has profound implications. Yeah. And the question is whether it's going to be intentional or not.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the myth of the free market endures, and it's a bipartisan myth. Like, we generally, it even shows up in the way that we talk about markets. And I'll put myself in the first category. I often used to talk about markets and government action as intervention. Well, government intervenes in the housing market to make it this way, or the Fed intervenes in money markets to do X, Y, or Z. And even in that linguistic construction, we're creating a metaphor which is just patently false. It just doesn't reflect the current reality or the past. And that metaphor suggests that a market is some kind of natural, organic thing. Like an animal of its own that acts of its own volition, or a stream that just naturally flows downhill. And then here comes the state, the nanny state from the other side, ready to, in many cases, mess it up, is like the idea when we talk about intervention, I think, a lot of the time. And that is just not what happens in most of the major markets today. So just to take the Federal Reserve as one that is right under our noses, the Fed literally sets the price of short-term credit. In a world where people are worried about price controls and wage controls, the Fed decides how much money is going to cost, the short-term interest rate, and then enforces that by using its enormous $7 trillion balance sheet to pursue open market operations or administered rates. We don't have to get into all the technicalities. But the point is that it's not supply and demand that is determining the short term of monetary policy. If you get further out towards the 15, 30-year debt, then those forces are more active. But the Fed is managing that market. And of course, when push comes to shove, and there's a financial crisis, the Fed is there because the institution exists to provide a lifeline to a lot of institutions that need it. We don't have any institution like that for housing or for basic commodities in the United States, or even for healthcare. And so those markets are much more chaotic, full of ups and downs. And I think that we can learn some of the lessons of where the Fed works and apply it in some of these other places. So that's a long-winded way of saying that I don't think that the free market versus planning dichotomy is really useful at all, because in so many of the markets that people might think are naturally operating, the state is there structuring it, managing it.
Well, and it was interesting because you did spend quite a bit of time on the Fed and particularly on Alan Greenspan.
Yeah.
And so you had a situation where his approach was more free market, or at least encouraging maybe some additional risk-taking with some of these new products that he thought would be more innovative and make the market more efficient. And it ended up leading to the Great Recession. Yeah. And they also didn't rescue, he was gone already, but then they didn't rescue Lehman Brothers, which made it worse. Yeah. And so what did we learn from that?
Yeah. So I think Alan Greenspan is so the book is written, it's organized around about a dozen stories of market crafters, of people, telling their human stories, but also trying to understand what they did well and where they made mistakes. Ironically, even though I disagree with a lot of what Alan Greenspan was organizing for, he was a quite successful market crafter in my view, because he had a clear mission, which in his case was deregulate, but also financial innovation. He genuinely believed that financial innovation was going to create more efficient markets, was going to enhance market discipline. So the idea that if one firm's going bad, the other firms will see it and they'll stop lending to it. And that new efficiency would make the financial system more stable and more resilient. And I mean, we all know how the story turned out. So I think that was proven incorrect. And he still had that mission, and he organized and crafted markets to make that happen. So I think it's an illustrative example of market craft. In my book, it's not a normative idea. It's sort of like tax policy or industrial policy or competition policy. It's a practice that can be used for what I would call good ends, like combating the climate crisis or building more housing, or it can be used towards goals that I personally wouldn't support. Like I don't think that we need a lot more financial innovation to make the system work better. So it's less about market craft is good or it's bad, but more it's this historical practice that we have not wrestled with in any kind of real way in American history, and only if we wrestle with it now and understand where it goes where it happens in a positive way, can we do it well in the future.
Speaking of housing,
yeah.
So one of the I may have a few opinions on that.
A couple.
So you early in the book you spend quite a bit of time on Jesse Jones, who that's the name.
It is,
okay,
yeah,
great. Who first Herbert Hoover, but really FDR put in charge of just an enormous swath of the economy to try to rescue and stabilize the country during the Great Depression, excuse me. And he, one of the things that he did was, well, they created Fannie Mae, right? And Fannie Mae et al. Played a key role in really creating the modern concept of home ownership and how the system works. And that was sort of classic market crafting. I mean, leading to the 30-year mortgage, which is not typical in the world, but we created that in the US, and it dramatically expanded home ownership. So the federal government has played a huge role in crafting that market. And then that sort of stopped. I mean, Fannie Mae continued, of course, but the federal government sort of receded. And now, during the Great Recession, of course, that collapse had a profound impact on the housing market. And then today we have just profound underproduction of housing. And so what would a housing market craft have looked like in 2008 if they decided to say, we're going to try to turn this around? Because there was underproduction in the 30s too. What would that have looked like in 2008? And what would it look like today if we decided to really take the bull by the horns and say we're going to build a lot more housing for everyone who needs it? Yeah,
it's a huge question. So let me try to break it down into a few pieces. I think the Jesse Jones housing story in the Depression is actually pretty important as a foundational lesson here. So Jesse Jones is this frontier businessman who makes a lot of money in Houston, and in 1932, Roosevelt names him the head of the National Investment Bank that had been created by Hoover, with the mandate to, at first, prevent the crisis from spiraling, and then later to spur all kinds of new development in markets. So if you remember from maybe some of you might be experts, some of you less so. The Great Depression is actually two recessions. The first one begins between 1929 and lasts for several years. Then there's a tepid recovery, and then there's there's a moment in 1937 where the Fed tightens. And Congress and Roosevelt have decided that they're out of it, and then all of a sudden the economy goes back off a cliff. So at that moment, everybody is starting to think about housing, both domestic legislators, and you've got John Maynard Keynes, the famed economist, writing to Roosevelt being like, if you are going to support one market right now, you've got to support housing, because housing construction involves a huge number of jobs, and it helps families have the need for shelter. It was a particularly powerful stimulus kind of industry. So Jesse Jones and Roosevelt, in collaboration with Congress, team up to create Fannie Mae and create this 30-year mortgage, which, of course, the innovation of the 30-year mortgage is that it makes it cheap, super cheap to buy housing. Historically, mortgages had been 5 years, 10 years maximum. And the way they create the 30-year mortgage is by making a market for it. So if a bank in Colorado were to lend to somebody for a 30-year mortgage in 1937, before that, it was really just on the balance sheet of that bank in Colorado. But now, because Fannie Mae was willing to buy, it created a national market for the 30-year. So the point is they wanted more housing construction, they developed a tool to do it, and they organized the market to make it happen. And housing starts went up significantly in the years after. And of course, the Second World War, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation got involved in all kinds of other industries. But I think it's an illustrative example because there was a clear mission. There was an institution that was created and was charged with making that mission happen, and it was successful. And so then if you zoom forward over time, I'm not quite as sure as you that the federal government receded from those markets. In some ways, leading up to the 2008 crisis, in making it easier for banks to loan to folks who otherwise wouldn't have been able to get a mortgage. That was a congressional decision in the 90s. But then a lot of those companies were quite predatory in pushing those mortgages on people. But there was a lot of public policy that was trying to craft those markets to extend home ownership, some of which was done quite badly. And so then what could have been done in those years after the housing crisis? I think the most important thing would have been a housing relief fund to provide for people who were meaningfully underwater on their mortgages, who had bought these houses, the values had come down, the market was illiquid, they couldn't sell, and their costs were very high. We had all kinds of bailouts for the banks. We had TARP, the Fed stepped in, all of that was ready. But there was no meaningful movement for housing relief for people. And I think a big reason for that is because we didn't have an institution in the federal government that was responsible for making housing accessible. It could have been done, but it wasn't. And so then if you fast forward to our period now, I think a lot of the housing shortages that we have are certainly because of what a lot of the abundance folks talk about, the difficulty in building, the challenges of process, et cetera. It's also because interest rates are very unpredictable, and the first industry that interest rates hit is housing. It's with rates as high as they are now, it's very hard to make the math work, and so that can call for all kinds of ideas, like a housing construction fund that would make the interest rates much more stable. Particularly, I would prefer for multifamily developers. You could have an industrial policy for modular housing. There's a lot of different ideas that I think we need to talk about. But I don't know, you have thought so much about housing and passed so many of these pioneering bills that I don't know, what of that seems to resonate or what doesn't?
So I think a lot of that resonates, but and I agree with you, there's the work that we do, and it's happening around the country now, to try to remove regulatory barriers to building housing, right? So restrictive zoning that literally makes it illegal to build multi-unit housing in vast swaths of the country, or a permitting process where anyone can just jack you up and
Right.
obstruct for years. And if they have money for a lawyer, they can make it go on for a long time.
Yeah.
And we're methodically fixing that. But what we have now seen is that, okay, we're putting all these laws in place, and then of course you have the pandemic, and then you have high interest rates, and there are all these supply chain issues. And so it seems to me, so the other issue is the volatility of the industry. So coming out of the Great Recession basically destroyed the construction industry in the United States. You had just a liquidation of the industry. The construction workforce took more than a decade to recover after that, because the construction workers just started other kinds of jobs.
Yeah.
And so wouldn't it be great to have robust investment? It could be direct investment through a national investment fund, or a sovereign wealth fund, as this president calls it, to stabilize it, so that if you go into a downturn or you have super high interest rates, then you can keep the construction industry going.
Yes.
And maybe they're building more on the public side and the private side.
Yeah.
You can keep the construction workers employed, and you can have that stability, because it's a huge boom bust problem we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that smoothing of the investment cycle, there's a lot of research that shows that when you can smooth those investment cycles and make the borrowing cheaper over the long term, it makes the math much easier. Of course, so does all of the regulatory changes that you're talking about. If we had if we could lower energy costs, it'd also make the steel cheaper. I mean, there's a lot of ways to get into the problem, but I think that we need to think about this in sort of multiple modalities with several kinds of changes being needed. Yeah,
I mean, the government can also stockpile construction materials so that if there are supply chain issues, they can continue to.
Yeah.
So let's shift to healthcare, another huge issue for many, many years, and the history you provided about the healthcare industry and so much of what was happening 100 years ago is actually a little bit similar now. But one of the you talked had a really good description of the creation of Medicaid and Medicare, and it was a little bit more random than people think. There was that one senator from Arkansas.
Yeah, Robert Mills.
Yeah. And it was such a huge feat to create Medicaid and Medicare.
Yeah.
But you are, well, there are two pieces I want to talk about it. One is when we talk about state capacity and having government agencies that can really have the capacity to act, or empowered to act quickly and decisively, and have the resources and capacity and the expertise to do it. And here, Medicare and Medicaid, I think people were getting their cards within a year of the creation of the program. Affordable Care Act, it took like 4 years, and a computer meltdown, or a system meltdown. So there was that. But the other piece, I think you were critical of the creation of these programs, because it was not as comprehensive as it could have been, and it led to a very fragmented system with high costs. Did I say that correctly?
Directionally, yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Sorry, I'm sure you can say it much more articulately.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that in both of those examples, the issue is, who do you hold accountable for those failures? So in the ACA, the 4 years and the breakdown of the system, I couldn't name the government institution that was responsible for implementing that. Maybe some folks in the room could, but because there's no institution that's responsible for it, it becomes everybody's problem. And so those of us who've worked in the corporate sector or the private sector know that you have to have accountability for a problem, for any kind of challenge, if you're going to be able to see it through and then evaluate whether it was successful. I think it's important also not to romanticize what happened in the 60s. So, the healthcare markets are so complicated because, first off, I don't think it should even be a market, right? I think that we should have healthcare that's quality and affordable to everyone in the United States as a matter of right. Unfortunately, most Americans do not agree with that. And we had an attempt to do that in the late 40s a couple times, and it was resoundingly defeated. And then it took another 15 years to get to the basic outlines of the structure that we have now with Medicare and Medicaid alongside private options. And then over the following decades, we had the emergence of the CHIP program for kids and the VA, such that now half of the people in the United States get their health insurance through a public source. And yet we are still trying to craft those markets to have private sector actors own hospitals and provide services that I don't think should be. So in the 60s, though, this compromise was so clearly made because a lot of white congressmen, almost exclusively men, did not want any kind of centralized authority in the federal government to be able to provide health care to everyone out of fear that it would require healthcare to be made accessible to all Americans, including Black Americans and non-white Americans. And so you see these, folks tying themselves into pretzels to get to a place where they have what they call to mix the food metaphors, a 3-layer cake with Medicare, Medicaid, and the private options as being part of it. And so you get a very balkanized system. And because there is this distrust of centralized authority, we end up paying more. We pay double what other countries do in the total amount that we spend on healthcare for outcomes that are, about the same at the average, but can be much worse for the poor and underprivileged. And so the market is not crafted successfully at all, despite all of these attempts to do so, because of this wariness of centralized power. And it's enduring. So what I'm trying to say is not that there haven't been meaningful improvements. Like Medicare, I would have voted for Medicare if I were alive in 1965 and could have. I am supportive of the ACA, yes and yes. And I think it's an illustrative example of a place where we may be trying to craft a market that just shouldn't be a market at all.
Yeah, and the fragmentation is just severe. I mean, between the providers and the hospitals and the health plans and the pharmacy benefit managers, who I still don't know why that industry needs to exist, but and pharmaceutical companies, and we see it in the legislature. They're all at war with each other all the time, and it ends up creating this system of rent-seeking behavior that they sort of can plop down in this area and then just extract value that ends up driving up costs. And that's why for anyone who's ever had a medical issue when you're overseas and you go into a hospital and you are really stressed out about the cost, and then they're like, okay, that's $150,
right,
or free,
yeah, right.
and yeah, it's so.
But is that the block for bigger, more ambitious healthcare reforms in California? All of the, I don't know what we call them, the special interests, the private interests?
Yeah, I mean, we've been working for a few years now on pharmacy benefit managers, which are the drug middlemen who just, it drives up costs, it kills off community pharmacies, but they are now a huge industry. They're bigger than a lot of health plans, and it just, the money ends up at any level of government having enormous influence.
Yeah,
so,
and you see these private equity roll-ups too. I mean, we could talk about healthcare all day, but the private equity roll-ups in a lot of the hospitals and the healthcare systems, I think, are just jaw-dropping in the sense that they come in, cut costs, in some cases shut down hospitals, all to extract profits for themselves, and leaving all kinds of people without access to basic health care. And it's why in the world would we structure a system to work that way?
Yeah, and Medicare does have, when we talk about a movement towards single payer or some version of that, the administrative costs in Medicare are way lower than the private health plans.
Yeah, the CBO estimates, if we had Medicare for all, or something like a savings of $500 billion. I mean, they're really significant. That's from 2020, so it's a little dated, but it's a lot.
Yeah. Yep. So let's talk a little bit about energy. I know in the book, the energy market crafting, a lot of times it revolved around crisis.
Yeah.
Like in the early 70s with the oil crisis and OPEC, doing its embargo or limiting supply, and then the U.S. would react to that. And in fact, I think I saw, does the U.S. now produce more oil than Saudi Arabia?
I think so.
I think so it does. So maybe not the best from a climate perspective, but certainly reflected, I think, some policy approaches. First of all, in terms of, do you think energy market crafting is typically driven by crisis? And how can we make it because also even with some of the clean energy shifts we're seeing today, which part of which is, I think, a form of market crafting, it's also a crisis.
Indeed,
Maybe not the same crisis as it's now $5. I remember when I was a kid, $5, which was really high back then. So it's a little bit of a crisis now.
Yeah.
So is it crisis driven?
There's nothing like a crisis to spur market craft and to get Republicans and Democrats to agree to do something to solve that crisis. And then the challenge becomes, how do you make those structures endure? So a crisis can be very acute, like the 1973 crisis, or it can be more diffuse, like the climate crisis, which is always here and everywhere, and yet, on any given Tuesday, folks might not feel its impact. So I think the 70s are a really illustrative example to inform policy today. So I've always been obsessed with the 1970s, and in the past few years, a lot of the things that happened then have become all the more relevant. So there are actually two energy crises in the 1970s. Sometimes when we look back, there's just this kind of cultural memory of long gas lines, and we're like, man, government really messed that up. And when you actually look closer, in the first oil crisis, government actually did a pretty good job. So it was the hardest chapter of the book for me to write was the one on these crises, because I put at the center of the story this market crafter named Bill Simon, who is just a libertarian's libertarian. Like, I was like reading through the guy's like letters and his writings. He ended up writing a couple books, and he was just crass and dismissive, and you could feel the know-it-all energy coming out of it. And it was unlike some of the other characters that I loved. I really just couldn't stand the guy. And in 1973, he is appointed deputy secretary of the Treasury by Richard Nixon, and the portfolio he gets is energy. And already American oil production in that period was going down, and then there's the Yom Kippur War and the oil embargo. And all of a sudden, all of the oil that America has been importing is just cut off. And it's the fall, and we're headed into a winter. And in that period, people in New England in particular needed home heating oil to keep their homes warm. And so there was a real profound concern that Americans could freeze to death if we did not figure out how to get adequate supplies of oil and gas, let alone problems, with gas lines and everything else. So this libertarian suddenly steps in, charged by Congress to run this thing called the Federal Energy Office, and becomes a market crafter. All of a sudden, he's administering price controls to make sure that the prices don't go up too fast. He's doing allocation decisions about which regions get how much of what kind of energy supplies. They're making refinery decisions. They're deciding which hospitals and military bases are going to get stuff. They're even deciding the rations or the amount that's distributed to each gas station. And if you watch what happens between October and March of that year, prices go up by about 20%. In Europe, they double. They go up by 100%. And with the exception of 1 week, 10 days in February, where there are some lines, there actually are not the incredible shortages that many predicted, and no one freezes to death. So it is a real success in the sense of navigating a crisis effectively. Then you compare that with the second oil crisis at the end of the decade, when Jimmy Carter's president, and it's right after the Iranian Revolution, And it's almost the inverse of the story. You know what Carter says? Carter says, well, we're just going to let the market figure it out. He decontrols prices, and they go straight up and through the roof. There's no attempt to manage distribution markets. He turns down the thermostat in the White House and says everybody needs to put on a sweater. Personal responsibility will take care of it. You see enormous lines for gas at gas stations. You see all kinds of distributive problems, and it takes years to manage and to climb back. And eventually, the good news is that out of these crises comes an institutional solution, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which we still have hundreds of millions of barrels of oil are, in these salt caverns, mostly on the Gulf Coast in the United States. And that's there to be sure that we can go well over 100 days now without importing any oil. And we haven't had an oil crisis of that scale since. And so I think what I'm trying to say is that, ironically, that Strategic Petroleum Reserve that I was just describing, the folks who authored that were Bill Simon and Alan Greenspan. Like, people you would not think, because they saw the need for a governmental institution to build resiliency into a market that could be extremely volatile. And so if they could do that for oil and gas, I think we need to challenge ourselves to think about that for basic food commodities, for eggs, for coffee. We had strategies for these things in the 1950s and back to the 1930s. There are ways to think about stabilizing prices that don't just rely on calling up the Fed to jack up interest rates, sending unemployment through the roof. We just need to bring our creativity to bear to solve it.
So speaking of stabilizing prices, there's a chunk of the book about antitrust or anti-monopoly efforts, because that is a form of market crafting to say we're not going to allow these. Yeah,
we want markets to be competitive and fair. Yeah.
And it's interesting because on the one hand, it's somewhat of a free market approach to say let's make sure there's competition and innovation, but it's never really on its own. It's being sort of shepherded through, and so we. The book does, I think, a really good job talking about the sort of the path of thinking around anti-monopoly efforts, and just how economists have really veered over time. Yeah. Whether it's more about prices or more about competition. And so, like, for example, with like Amazon, which obviously can reduce competition, and they haven't wield enormous power, but some would say, well, they keep prices low, which isn't always true, but that seems to be the argument. And so Lina Khan came in under President Biden and seemed to have bipartisan support. But
she did, 12 Republican senators voted for her confirmation.
But then got replaced once the administration changed. Can you just talk a little bit about how she really shook things up a lot and ruffled feathers and made enemies, probably the good kind of enemies. Talk a little bit about her approach. Yeah,
so I traced the last third of the book is contemporary, in the sense that it goes from 2009 to today. And I traced two characters' evolutions. One is Brian Deese, who is the director of the National Economic Council, responsible for a lot of the climate work and the chips and semiconductor work, and then Lina Khan, who is just fascinating. I wrote a piece in 2019 calling for Facebook to be broken up, and I got to the point where I felt the confidence to be able to write that based on a lot of academic work that I had done, but it was only after I wrote that I was able to really engage with a whole community of scholars and activists who were reinvigorating antitrust and anti-monopoly. And so I met her then, but knew her only really superficially. And then in the context of the book, like all the other characters, I went really deep. And not only got to talk with her a lot for it, but also was checking the footnotes in her undergraduate thesis at Williams College, and trying to understand the family that she came from in order to understand the human behind all of this. And so I think her story is really symbolic of what I think it takes to do successful market craft. You have to have someone who has, I think, real entrepreneurial energy. And that is the word that I would use to describe Lena, in that she brings determination to achieve this mission of making markets more competitive and fair, and a creativity to do it, to the work. And then when she's in charge of an institution like the Federal Trade Commission that has meaningful power to enforce the law, you get a lot of results really fast. I mean, she comes in and at the very beginning, the FTC, people have forgotten it now, but blocks NVIDIA's attempt to buy ARM and consolidate. This was before ChatGPT and the AI revolution. They were trying to consolidate the market for advanced semiconductors even then. And she leads the FTC in actually a unanimous decision with the Republicans as well to block that. And then she goes about her work over the next several years, refiling the Meta case, filing a new case against Amazon, but also winning cases in the healthcare sector with the Illumina Grail merger. They stopped the largest grocery consolidation that had ever been considered between Kroger's and Albertsons. And she wins 90% of the cases that, or I should say the actions that the FTC brings under her leadership. But they don't stop at that. They also rewrite the actual rules, what are called the merger guidelines, for how all mergers are going to be evaluated, and all kinds of other disclosure agreements. And they get rid of non-compete. These agreements that a lot of workers, including from Quiznos to engineers in Silicon Valley, have to sign, say, I can't compete with anyone. I mean, talk about something that locks down competition. If a worker can't just go to a competing company, then that labor market isn't competitive. So what I'm trying to get at is, I think just on the merits, her tenure is, wildly successful. And what you see now is that despite what many might expect around what the Trump FTC or the Trump Justice Department would be doing, they're continuing a lot of Lina Khan's policies. Those vertical merger guidelines that I was just saying, they kept them. They are prosecuting the Meta case that she refiled, and they're in court right now in Washington. They are continuing along on the Amazon case. I mean, we can go through a lot of examples. And so it's different. Their antitrust, to be clear, is different than what Lena supported. But talk about a successful market crafter. Yeah. I think, I end the book with her, and there's a reason why.
And it'll be interesting, that transition, because my sense is that Lina Khan was very equal opportunity in terms of who she would, by industry, mm-hmm. right? It seemed very consistent, her philosophy and approach. We'll see under this administration, obviously they don't like big tech. We know that, even though they were all sitting.
Yeah, I know. You say obviously, but I think there are these cross currents. Yeah,
I guess, but they still, at least rhetorically, and we'll see if they're willing to go after other corporate, other industries in the same way as an Amazon or a Meta, because he has his grievances against them for various reasons.
Yeah, we will see. And to be clear, I think it is too early to tell. I mean, there are signs just recently that on healthcare, the Justice Department is investigating United Healthcare. Listen, I'm under no illusions that this administration is incredibly friendly with corporate America. Like, the president himself is a billionaire who got, and who's like issuing new cryptocurrencies as like scam. I mean, it's really, it would be comic if it weren't so tragic and outrageous. I think that's just important to say. And I also think that there is a strand in the new Republican Party that is actually bigger than Trump. That's more about Josh Hawley and J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, those folks who are interested in using state power to ensure that some markets are more competitive and holding some companies accountable. So I think there's, if it's not a war, it's at least a contest inside the Republican Party to see which of these groups will be more dominant in the years to come.
And do you have a prediction for how that's going to play out? Because if you look at some of the market crafting that happened under President Biden, where there may or may not have been Republican support. So the CHIPS Act had
Yeah.
Republican support. There was, I don't
Same
know if
thing.
it counts as a market craft, but the bipartisan infrastructure law, bipartisan support. I think the Inflation Reduction Act did not have bipartisan support.
No, it didn't. It didn't. But the CHIPS Act is a good example.
Yeah.
I mean, the CHIPS Act, actually, the idea for it came in Trump 1.
Yeah.
The Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the State Department, Keith Crack, who's from out here, pushed it in Congress. It built momentum, and then it was passed by bipartisan folks in the Congress. And even now, Trump's decided he's against it because it is a Biden holdover. But there are a lot of jobs that it's creating in Republican districts. And so I don't, of all the things I think that they'll move to undo, I don't put that one at the top of the list because it is helpful for a lot of those legislators, but also just from a national security perspective.
Yeah.
You know, we probably shouldn't be making advanced semiconductors on a little island off the coast of Taiwan that was encircled by 36 Chinese ships a few weeks ago. You know, it feels like if you believe in national security, you want to ensure that that market is alive, vibrant, and productive here in the United States.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about AI.
Yeah.
Because as another, I don't know if you would find it as a market craft, but the executive order that President Biden put out on AI, which working with the tech sector on it, and then they all immediately tore it down as soon as Trump came in and he rescinded it. But you know, I think there's been this push and pull about what to do about AI and how to promote it and deal with the risks. And we worked with Economic Security Project, your organization you chair, on a bill last year, Senate Bill 1047.
Well, we supported you leading on that.
It was a great team effort, and that was a bill, for those who don't know, that would have required for huge AI models to perform safety testing ahead of time to be able to try to get ahead of some of the potential risks, and that it ended up being just a war, and it was quite an experience.
And it passed both chambers.
Passed both chambers, and the governor vetoed it. But one of the pieces of that bill, which we've actually reintroduced this year, was something we call CalCompute, which is creating a public compute cluster so that folks have access to compute to be able to build models, and it's not sort of limited to the large AI labs. Is that a form of market craft if we're successful in doing that?
Well, I think the question is what does the AI ecosystem need? And if we think it needs more competition and more startups, then we have to ask, well, what do those startups need? And in an industry that has an extremely high cost of capital to get going, which naturally lends it to kind of oligopolistic structure. If you can lower that cost of capital by providing this public compute, then you are shaping that market to be more competitive. So, I think that's an intentional state decision to change the nature of AI markets. So that's crafting. That's crafting them for sure. The AI in general, people have asked at a federal level, what do I think we should be doing on to craft AI markets? I think that kind of public option for a cloud is a very good idea. And I'm skeptical of a lot of the other ideas. People have talked about big and public investment for AI companies, like Schumer and others had talked about that last year before Trump was elected. I think there's plenty of money flowing into AI companies. It's not a shortage of and also, despite the DeepSeek innovations, it seems like America is still leading. It may only be by a 6-month or 9-month time horizon, but things seem to be going in the right direction. So I have a whole chapter in the book around semiconductors in the 1980s and why that was such a critical moment to shape that industry out of national security and geopolitical concerns. And that seems very different to me than AI. So what I'm trying to say is, I'm not sure outside of the public option, I'm not sure we need some big, broad market craft for AI at this moment in time. Just because market craft is an opportunity or something doesn't mean that every industry needs a particular industrial policy to change its course.
Well, and speaking of DeepSeek, you talk in the book a bit about China.
Yeah.
And China's, I mean, the book mostly focuses on the U.S., but in terms of China, it's how would you describe China's approach? Because China went from, this very socialist country to pretty capitalist in a lot of ways, but there's a lot of state control.
Yeah.
And how there's control, is it market crafting, it's a combination of it.
I call China state capitalism.
Yeah.
And where credit, in the United States, we largely rely on private markets to allocate credit. Who should get investment should be made mostly by private actors and not by the state, except in some of these exceptions where we say, climate's super important, and so we're going to put some public dollars there, but even there, it's to attract private ones. That's not what happens in China. The credit, at least for the large sectors, is managed effectively by the state. The banking industry is effectively owned by the state or directly organized and directed. But the same thing goes with the nature of the real estate industry. So many of their it's more akin to planning. This the P word that everybody in the United States fears. I understand why, for good reason, because I think a lot of the dynamism of what we do in the United States comes from private sector competition, these kinds of fair and open markets that we were just talking about in the antitrust context. And when we're at our best in the US, we can steer them, we can guide them. And that's somewhere in between the extremes of state capitalism of China over here and the kind of the free market, laissez-faire fantasy on the other side.
Great. Okay, I think it's time for questions. We have a few with some very good handwriting. Okay. California is wealthier than many countries. We're now the 4th largest economy in the world. We moved ahead of Japan. And
that's amazing.
Has had a supermajority of Democrats for many years. Why do you both think California has been unable to successfully craft its markets to achieve popular goals like affordable housing, renewable energy, universal health care, et cetera?
I think this one, I live in New York, so I mean, I'm happy to weigh in, but I think you might know a lot more about this than I.
Yeah, so I don't, I think when we talk about abundance, the two pieces of it, one is making things move more efficiently to get good things done, but the other is about state capacity. Mm-hmm. And you talk about this in the book, about having agencies that are fully empowered and have the expertise and the resources to be able to get the job done without being sort of micromanaged. And we have, I think in some areas, we've done it successfully. We have an agency called the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, that is fairly independent of the legislature. And what we do, which is frustrating to legislators sometimes, we sometimes, instead of making the decision, we say, this is the general goal we want to achieve. Figure it out, and we are giving you the power to do it. Mm-hmm. And again, that's often the right thing to do, even though it's frustrating for opinionated legislators. And we've done that with CARB, and CARB has really blazed a trail in terms of California's climate policies around electric vehicles, around various kinds of emission standards, and with whether factories or whatever else, and it's become a target, of course. So I think that we have done it in some areas. There are other areas where we've not. I think housing, it has been it's been such a battleground around local control versus state control, and so I think I would like us to take a better approach there, but the idea of having a centralized state housing agency with actual real significant power, we have some of that, but that becomes a culture war. And then on healthcare, we have, in California, we now have a majority of people are on, 40% of Californians are on Medicaid.
Yeah. Wow.
We've really,
40% are on Medicaid.
And we have undocumented people can access Medicaid. And when you add in Medicare and VA and Obamacare, it's like more than a majority of Californians are on government-related healthcare, but we still have that fragmentation, and it's an industry battle. We've tried to move towards more of a single-payer model, and that it's just blown up every time.
I wonder if legislators at a state level are even more loath to empower administrative institutions than at a federal level, because there's I hear in what you're saying that a big block is like if like with it's CARB, right? If we could create those institutions and give them this mission and mandate and the power to get it done, I mean, obviously the legislature can check that power, they can hold them accountable, they could change that at any moment, but it would still be about giving experts the ability to pursue that goal rather than a lot of nitpicking or something.
Yes, and I would say we have another agency that I think has been less successful, which is the California Public Utilities Commission, which is very independent under our Constitution, and has like oversight over all of the utilities and solar energy, et cetera. And we set them up, and then the legislature put a lot of rules in place to make it hard for them to function. And so I think we did it better with CARB than we did with the Public Utilities Commission. It's interesting at the federal level in terms of having these empowered agencies that can do it. The Supreme Court is sort of pouring cold water on that because they made up that, what's it called, the major question doctrine.
And non-delegation,
Non-delegation. So the Supreme Court, just out of whole cloth, created a doctrine, as you may know, that any kind of significant question has to be determined by Congress, not by the agency. And then they eliminated what's called Chevron deference, where courts defer to the expertise of administrative agencies. So they really, I wonder what impact that's going to have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those moves are not great for the administrative state and for the insulation that comes with it. And I think Congress can fix a lot of that stuff by being clearer. But Trump is challenging this right now with threats to remove Jay Powell as chair of the Fed. I mean, he's illegally fired 2 of the 5 commissioners of the Federal Trade Commission. The law is very clear. They cannot be fired except for cause.
Right.
And he does not care. He fired them, and they're suing. And the Supreme Court will decide obviously he's firing them thinking that the Supreme Court will follow some gestures that it's made over recent years and say that actually the FTC Act from 1913 is unconstitutional because it does not invest the executive authority in the president, and the president should have the ability to hire or fire anyone in the administrative state. And it's possible that they uphold that, but I think it would be, it's truly at the frontiers of believability, but with this court, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. Although it didn't go well for them today with birthright citizenship. So you never know when people reach the end of their rope. Let's hope. Yeah. So here's a question from the audience. How are market crafters different in Europe? And are there better examples, ? Denmark, and worse, ? Greece?
Yeah, I could have written a whole book about Europe or Japan or some of these, or South Korea, or a lot of other countries that have pursued what people call an aggressive development policy, aggressive industrial policy, aggressive market craft. I think that for the most part, they don't have the same suspicion of centralization. And those countries get a lot more done faster. So I'm a Francophile, so I know a lot about the French context. They even have a word for market craft that no one's yet offered to translate the book into French. But if they do, I will have all kinds of thoughts. They call it dirigisme. The ability to diriger is to guide something, is to run something in a certain direction. And because they have a different approach to centralization of power, they can get a lot more done. They're building. Some folks might know, but they're building dozens, if not maybe even 100 new subway. It's so many subway stations that they're building in France in the course of like 7 years around Paris that it's just head scratching how they can do that so effectively compared to what we can do here. And I think it is because they have a practice of centralizing authority. That doesn't mean they always get it right, clearly. And when it comes to government effectiveness and crafting the markets, they can move.
Well, and that's interesting. And by the way, I've never done one of these interviews before. Is it bad form to mention another book?
No.
Okay.
No.
I don't know. Because there's
You're not going to be kicked off the stage by me.
No, there was a book that came out recently, Why Nothing Works.
Yeah, the Mark Dunkelman book.
And that was the whole progressives veering between like New Deal centralization and diffuse what we have now, where no one's in charge. And vitocracy. And I think that's absolutely right.
I mean, to be honest, I think my book, Dunkelman's book, and the Abundance book, they've all sort of come out together, and we know each other loosely. I had the same editor as Ezra's editor for the book, so literally he was in the mix for all of these. So I think they're all sort of in dialogue with one another, and they all generally point towards that mandate for improved state capacity by saying, well, we can't just give up on government. We've got to invest in it to make sure it works. Yeah.
So another provocative question. I'm reading this here. These are not my words, although I may agree with it. Techno-libertarians are having the time of their lives right now. How can we dismantle the unholy alliance between Trump and the bro-oligarchy?
Man, that is the question. This is the first time I've been in San Francisco since the election, and I'm asking everybody some version of that, which I think has at its root the question, what happened politically to so many of these leaders in Silicon Valley for them to be not just like supportive of Trump, but avid advocates for him and the administration. And my sense is that it has a little bit to do with profit, a lot to do with ego, and also a lot to do with pragmatism. Somebody told me that most of these folks, let's bracket out Elon Musk for a second and just talk about the others. Most of them feel like they're on the path of righteousness, that they're going to change the world. Like Mark Zuckerberg certainly feels that Facebook and the related companies are going to wire the world. And that was his mission. I mean, this was true 20 years ago when we were roommates, and I think that has endured. And so given that, you need to have practical alliances with people in power that you might not like. I think that's part of what can justify that at the same time as he sees an opportunity for increased growth. And he did think that maybe Trump would drop the FTC's case. He went and visited with him several times to reportedly see if the FTC case against Meta, which is now at trial, wouldn't happen, and it continued. So I think what I'm trying to get at is there's a desire for to build companies that have these big missions, to blow up these folks' egos, certainly to make money and make a profit. And they see this administration as being more friendly to that. At least they did at the beginning of it. I mean, we're only, 3-4 months in, and I'm not sure their hopes and dreams are really coming to fruition. The one counterexample to that is the crypto folks. Trump is very supportive of it, and they seem to be having all kinds of success. But the Trump administration filed suit against Uber 3 weeks ago. And they're continuing to prosecute a lot of these cases. They don't talk about it as much, but Mike Johnson and others are still for Section 230 repeal, which would change the liability structure. So I'm not sure the honeymoon period is going to last very long.
Yeah. I have one last question, and that is about science. And this was not in the book, but it just sort of occurred to me. So we have this situation now where they're taking a wrecking ball to all the federal science agencies. And so I was looking into the history about, I guess the National Science Foundation was created in the 1940s. And that the NIH, CDC, NOAA, et cetera, that have just turbocharged scientific innovation,
Yeah.
Created many industries and companies, and you have the University of California and Stanford, who've been such recipients of federal funding that played a key role in creating Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And so that strikes me as market crafting, maybe in a more diffuse way,
Yeah.
or something like that, or an industrial policy or something.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you agree with that, but it's also, it's deeply concerning, I think, and when we hear about scientists leaving the country. So I'm just curious your thoughts on
I mean, it's, at the very least, it's meaningful research and development investment for innovation, and we need it. I mean, the kinds of breakthroughs that happen are often caused by early investments like that. I was talking to someone on the phone about the abundance critique and the fact that government doesn't work. And I was in the back of an Uber, actually on 280, headed down to Sand Hill Road, and I said, right, government has become sclerotic. We need to build more. Yes, yes, and yes. And I'm talking to you on a cell phone that has its GPS location tracked by the satellites orbiting the Earth, thanks to government investment, by cell phone towers from a market with high capital that has been, organized and often supported by government, using the internet, which was a government project. And by the way, the touchscreen on the phone came from those exact early investments that were later commercialized. Not to mention the fact that, like, my driver has a driver's license, which comes from the government, and we're on a road that's an interstate that's funded by the government. And so, yes, we need to be honest about all of these moments when government fails and we cannot build housing fast enough or high-speed rail. We have to be clear-eyed about that as a challenge if we're going to get better. And we also need to recognize that government can and is a force for good in the world. And only once we do that are we going to say we can't just crash down the administrative state like Elon Musk is doing. We have to reform it and invest in it and make it better. And that might mean placing more responsibility and having higher expectations for government. And so that's true on science funding, and it's true on a whole host of other areas. And so ultimately, I hope this book is a hopeful point in that direction, looking at the past in order to inform the future, and so that we know that we can make the world that we all want.
Great. Well, Chris, thank you so much. What a wonderful evening.
This was great.
Thank you. Yeah.
That was really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.